sim racing chassis provided by Next Level Racing. Check them out at nextlevelracing.com.
Welcome to Inside Sim Racing. I'm John Sable, and today we are taking a first look at the Formula Renault 2.0 that's coming to iRacing next week in the Season 2 build. And for this first look, we've taken the car to Brands Hatch to take a few laps around and talk about how the car handles and maybe look at a few of the different features showing up in the build next week. So let's go ahead and check out those laps. So here we are in the Formula Renault 2.0 at Brands Hatch. Figured Brands Hatch would be a pretty good combo with this car. A couple things before we get started. First, I want to mention that this is a pre-release build, so some things are subject to change. And second, I want to mention what we're driving with. Driving with the Thrustmaster T300 with the Ferrari Formula 1 rim, T3PA pedals, all on the Next Level GT Ultimate chassis. So let's talk about the car, and to be honest, I'm a little surprised how it handled. I was really expecting going into this for the Renault to be really planted and have a lot of downforce and, you know, be even more secure feeling than the Star Mazda is. And actually it's the opposite of that. The car is very, I wouldn't say twitchy, but you have to be careful driving it. It can be a handful through the corners, and it just kind of feels like the car doesn't have quite enough tire and doesn't have quite enough aero. The car, I will say, does feel light, which is kind of funny because the car pretty much weighs the same amount as the Star Mazda. That's pretty much the benchmark for this car. And whether it weighs more or less kind of depends on which iRacing stats you use for the Mazda. iRacing has the Renault listed at 1,115 pounds, while on the members website they have the Mazda listed at 1090, and on the public website it's listed for 1140. So that pretty much splits the difference, but either way, this car essentially weighs the same as the Star Mazda. Now, one thing that is different though is this car is down 30 horsepower to the Star Mazda. The Renault has 210 horsepower, the Mazda has 240, and you feel the difference. One thing that's interesting with the Renault is that the power band is very slim. You find yourself shifting a lot to keep the revs up. It's a 7-speed transmission, so maybe that's part of it, but really working away at those paddles a lot more around here than you do in the Star Mazda. And it definitely, like I said, feels like it is lacking a little bit of horsepower to the Star Mazda. But with all those differences aside, it's pretty entertaining to drive. Like I said, it just doesn't feel like it has quite enough tire and, you know, a little lacking some downforce in the corners. And you really got to be on top of your game. And because of that, you have to drive it somewhat gingerly. You have to get on the brakes a little sooner and a little lighter than you would expect an open-wheel car. The steering, you have to be minimal inputs. It's very responsive. Coming off the corners, you can get on the throttle pretty good, pretty aggressively, since it is only 210 horsepower. But yeah, it's not nearly as stuck as I was anticipating it to be. Another thing I want to point out are the frame rates. So we're running this in DX11, 1920 by 1080, and as you can see, the frame rates are well into the 200s. I will say that I did try this out in DX9, and it is actually displaying fewer frame rates than it did in DX9. In DX9, it was running around 300, and honestly, I kind of wanted to put that side to side to show you guys the difference, but I didn't want to cause big freak out because DX11 titles run at less frame rates. We did a benchmark of the GTX 970 car from EVGA back a couple months ago, and we had a mix of DX11 and DX9 sim titles, and the DX11 always ran less than DX9, 25 to 50% less frames per second when out there on the track running by yourself. The difference is, in DX9, when you start to get around a bunch of cars, all those frame rates decrease dramatically. DX11, you just don't have that. Also, in DX11, even though it runs at fewer frames, it's a lot smoother. For some reason, DX9 needs to be run at a lot higher frame rates to be smooth, and even then, once in a while, you'll have it where you get a dip and you get some stutters on screen, where DX11 can run in the 80, 90, 100 frames per second and be a lot smoother than DX9 at, say, 110, 120 frames per second. So that's just what DX11 does, and I don't think it's anything to be alarmed about or worried about. Still pulling extremely strong frame rates. And from everything I've seen so far, DX11 seems to be running pretty smooth. So getting back to the Star Mazda and Formula Renault 2.0 comparison, let's just show you how these two cars compare, because they're very close. So in this comparison, you can see some of the things I was talking about earlier. Definitely should pay attention to what gear I'm running in. The Star Mazda not shifting nearly as much as the Renault. Also, the Star Mazda was quite a bit more planted, and it was actually quite surprising. I was running baseline setup in both cars, and this was the fast lap I had in both cars, which was done on lap 3. These aren't spectacular times, but I do feel like it's a pretty good heads-up comparison between the two. A big lurch there in the Star Mazda, catching a little bit too much curb. And as you can clearly see, this is going to be a really tight race to the line. Pretty much, I'm thinking these cars are going to be running very similar lap times, which is kind of surprising. Like I said, the Star Mazda felt a lot easier to drive and has a little more horsepower, a little better power to weight ratio, yet it only barely beat out the former Renault. So that's going to wrap it up for our first look at the Renault 2.0. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and if you're not subscribed, please do that as well. And gonna leave you here with a little moment of zen, showing some interesting things happening. So for John Sable, thanks for watching Inside Sim Racing. See you guys next time.